with the proponents of gay marriage. Now, how do we cut through these fallacies that increasingly undermine marriage in the United States? Because soon we're going to see the inevitable push to legalize other alternative forms of unions as marriages as well. So what are we to do? So here's an interesting question for you. Can secular laws protect and strengthen natural marriage? Yes, no? Good. The answer is no. For a reason that you may not realize. History suggests that this is a false hope because many states have laws against unmarried couples living together, and despite this, many do. Prostitution and pornography laws seek to protect the marriage commitment, yet they still plague our society. And sodomy laws seek to curb immoral sexual actions, yet many practice it. So all of these laws seek to forcibly remove immoral actions from our presence, yet they remain. What these secular laws are really intended for is what? The hardness of man's heart. That's what they're really targeting. A hardness that grows ever harder in the absence of what? The absence of God. The presence of Christ in people's hearts. Now you may be asking, what's the point to this whole line of thought when there are so many people who reject Jesus? That's a fair question. That people reject Jesus only increases the importance of our witness for natural marriage. It doesn't lessen the importance. It's only through our true exercise of Christian discipleship that the marital vocation will be saved. The ultimate source of strength for the marital covenant we've established with our respective spouses are the sacraments of reconciliation and the Eucharist. And guys, flowers on occasion don't hurt either. Right up there at the sacraments. And then worthy reception of these two sacraments and the occasional red rose, right? They're essential to any marriage. Now, these sacraments strengthen the spouse's covenant made with God and one another. So you realize when you were married, you established a covenant with each other, and then the two of you with God, because the marriage models the Trinity. So a federal marriage amendment cannot do this. Can a federal marriage amendment establish a covenant? Two individuals giving themselves fully to each other? And the answer is no, it cannot. To restore the correct understanding of marriage, the world must come to see the wisdom in God's design of marriage. So, ridiculous assertions regarding marriage are not uncommon these days. The natural understanding of marriage as an indissoluble union between one man and one woman is challenged on a daily basis in the media, in the courts, and everyday social situations. So how do we go about explaining what we believe about marriage is not the product of narrow-minded self-righteousness? How do you do that? How do we explain why it's not possible to alter marriage? And how do we explain why these new proposed marriages cannot possibly live up to God's design intentions for marriage? As I just said, God and the couple form a trinity. We establish covenant with each other. Now, the Catholic Church asserts that marriage is God's idea, not man's. It originated with Him. It is for God, then, to teach us what it is. At the onset of creation, He tells us man and woman are literally made for each other. We read in Genesis, "Therefore a man leaves his father and his mother and cleaves to his wife, and they become one flesh." This mic's driving me nuts. The word cleave means much more than just the marital act, but it also describes a union of persons at a spiritual level as well. After sin entered the world, The original design for marriage suffered a few setbacks. All right? And God began a process of re-educating his people. Now, for a time, there was polygamy. And Moses conceded divorce among his followers because of their hardness of heart. But Jesus declared that from the beginning, it was not so. And Jesus refers to Genesis 2 as he restores marriage to its original dignity, one man, one woman, becoming one. He leaves no doubt that this union of husband and wife is exclusive and indissoluble. What therefore God has joined together, let no man put asunder. Now, this unity of a man and a woman is not just physical. It's also a bond at the deepest level of their personhood. They literally become one. Not merely their bodies become one. Paul compares the marital union to the union of Christ and the church. Think about that union and the nature of how Christ is united with us in the church. Christ is joined to us, the church, both physically and spiritually. And like Christ's union with the church, their marital union is holy, it is made by God, and as such, it cannot be undone by man. Now, perhaps we think the phrase, you got any suggestions on this thing? This thing's ridiculous. All right. It's almost as bad as the mics we use at Mass. Most of you probably see me wrestle with mine through the whole Mass. Perhaps we think let man put asunder means that it's possible for a man to put this union asunder, but that he should not do so. Both common sense and Scripture contradict this interpretation. What man honestly thinks he can break a bond made by God? Think about that for a second. What man honestly thinks he could break that bond? As if to emphasize the point, Jesus goes on to warn that if one divorces his spouse and marries another, he would be committing adultery. Why? Because the original marriage bond is still intact. Now, I understand high probability there's people in here who've been through divorce, and it's not my intent to talk about that whole issue. I just want to make the point that the marriage bond is created by God. And this is why the Catholic Church persists in teaching against divorce, not because it stubbornly clings to old ways. It recognizes the permanence of this bond that was established. The Church's practice of investigating the validity of marriages is an exercise of the Lord's wisdom, truth, and mercy. This is why we know marriage is made in heaven. Today, it's perhaps more likely than in years past. Couples entering into marriage lack some of the necessary ingredients. For example, the full consent of one or the other may be impaired because they marry believing that divorce is a ready option if things get tough. Is that the way to enter marriage? Is that the way to enter into a bond of permanence? It is not. And the teaching of Jesus on the indissolubility of marriage may be considered by some to be a hard saying. So feeling unable to live up to Christ's teaching, a couple lowers their view of marriage to what seems doable for them. Is that what we need to be doing? Lowering our view of marriage. The problem is, yes, we can lower our idea of marriage, but what we can't lower is the aspirations of our heart. What would happen to your heart if the only love you ever experienced was conditional, temporary, and unfaithful? What would happen to your heart? It would become hard. You would be emotionally wounded, perhaps deeply so. God designed us to flourish in an atmosphere of committed, authentic love, just like the Trinity. And honestly, it's quite hard to argue against that. The high calling of marriage matches the high aspirational calling of the human heart. To try to change either one, marriage or our heart's aspiration, it's futile, and it just leads to suffering. But you would say and ask in response, well, isn't marriage kind of hard sometimes? Sure. Not mine. Good answer? Good answer. Yes, marriage is hard. And without God, a strong marriage is close to impossible. Generally speaking, the reason so many marriages fail is that our world has forgotten that marriage was never meant to be lived without God. Just wasn't, because He created it. Which is why a totally secular argument for natural marriage is only partway to the truth. In cases where Catholic couples have strained marriages, one or both typically have stopped praying or going to Mass. They have forgotten that one of the primary duties of spouses is to get one another to heaven. How many people know that? How many people remember that? One of your primary duties is to get each other to heaven. The strength of a marriage is in direct proportion to their relationship with God. The closer to God, the stronger the marriage. Why else would the divorce rate among devout couples be less than 5%? God's grace elevates our human love to share in His divine, unconditional, and unending love, which makes till death do us part not only possible, but joyful. Marriage is an encounter with the living Christ. Why do we have sacraments? Think about it for a second. The purpose of sacraments is to sanctify men and women. It's to build up the body of Christ, and it's to give worship to God. Because they are signs, they also instruct us. They not only presuppose faith, but by the words and objects, they also nourish, strengthen, and express our faith. This is why they are called the sacraments of faith. Each of the 7 sacraments is a unique communication between God and us. These special encounters between us and God give us a share or increase our share in God's supernatural life. And this is known as sanctifying grace. And these encounters come at particular times in our lives when we need them. And such is the case in the sacrament of matrimony. Perhaps when you might need it most. Marriage can't be anything we choose it to be because marriage is sacred, meaning it is something set apart for God. Marriage comes from God, and it is designed and meant to lead us to Him. Now, Jesus elevated marriage to a sacrament by His teaching on marriage and by the blessing of marriage with His presence at the wedding feast of Cana and through the church He founded. What does it mean He elevated marriage? Think about that. That phrase goes right past us. We don't think about it much. He elevated marriage. Every sacrament is a transforming encounter with the living Christ, and it's a means of receiving grace, the very life of God. We're being elevated. In elevating marriage, Christ opened marriage to the very life of God so that husband and wives have an ongoing source of grace open to them. Again, what's job 1 for a married couple? Get yourselves both to heaven. Not just one of you, both of you. Can you do it without grace? No. That's a good answer, but I want you to believe it. All right? You cannot do that without grace. The grace is how they can grow in holiness and find the strength, wisdom, and love necessary to live out your vows. When was the last time you thought about your vows and how well you're living them out? Marriage is also a vocation. It's a call from God to seek holiness in a particular way, in a particular state of life, with a particular person. This truth has been largely lost today. Although a vast majority of Americans profess belief in God, many do not consider God's will when they're entering marriage. They enter marriage strictly on the emotions of it. Marriage has become for them a personal choice, one that could be changed if things just don't work out. But marriage, because it's an image of the marriage of Christ and His church, it's meant to be faithful, it's meant to be lasting, it's meant to be fruitful. Now, marital love leads to God. Remember job 1. Get yourselves both to heaven. These days, almost any emotional relationship can be